century. He blogs on the Huffington Post, and so you can read some of his recent material through his blogs. And in terms of his academic accomplishments, he earned a Doctor of Philosophy degree from Oxford University, graduate law and divinity degrees from Yale University. His latest book is God and Caesar in America, an essay on religion and politics. And his talk today also bears that title. Please join me in welcoming Professor Hart.
First of all, I apologize for being late and appreciate your indulgence. It's all my fault. I am thankful to Professors Metcalf and Hildebrand for the invitation to be with you. And like you, I can hardly wait to hear what I have to say. I've been thinking desperately about philosophy and politics. My only qualification to be here is that I was an undergraduate philosophy major. Aside from that, I have absolutely no qualification to be talking about the topic of the series, but I'll do my best. I think it kind of migrated over the past month or two from philosophy of politics to religion and politics. There obviously is a fertile ground to explore in that regard. I was thinking about the degree to which my own undergraduate training, and to a degree graduate studies after that, which included philosophy and religion, prepared me or didn't prepare me for a period of time in politics. I never anticipated a political career. I'm always nervous when I see reference to my political career because I'm Jeffersonian in the sense that one engages in public service and then one moves on. And I'm equally nervous about careerism in politics, which we have an awful lot of. I had the opportunity in the Senate to serve with some very, very thoughtful people who served more than the 2 terms I served, and their contribution was substantial. It was also offset in too many cases by those who served multiple terms who had long since worn out their contribution to the public debate, and yet, for a whole lot of personal reasons, didn't want to go home, couldn't go home, couldn't think of another interesting thing to do outside of the Senate or Congress, and therefore stayed on. And their constituents continued to re-elect them, so that was their decision. But I did think both about my philosophy studies and my legal studies to the degree it taught me how to think, in both cases to think critically. And that is a quality that is sadly lacking, I think, in politics, driven in recent years particularly so heavily by ideology and partisanship, and so little by objective, analytical, critical thinking, which to me was one of the great benefits I derived from my study of philosophy. I also recollected that classical philosophers, at least, wrote an awful lot about politics. Aristotle not least, but certainly Plato and a host of others of the early philosophers. They did not see a distinction between the life of the mind and the life of the polis. In fact, they thought the two were necessary to each other, that a thinking citizen would almost necessarily be engaged in the public debate, and dialogue, and discussion, because how could you think about anything from your own existence to the existence of society and how society organized itself, and be disconnected from or disengaged in what we would today call the issues of the day? And so they spend a lot of time thinking and writing about how society should structure itself to govern itself. Politics, I think Plato once said, was the art of caring for souls. Very spiritual kind of definition. If you tried that out on most political audiences today, they would either throw things at you or hoot and jeer or drive you out of the room otherwise. But the art of caring for souls, and I kind of like that. If he didn't say it, he should have. My professorial friends here have to find, now I have the job of finding the Plato citation for that. And there's a prize for whoever comes up with it. I just think you have to read all of it. So I'm sure it's all of it's in your memory anyway. So critical thinking, engagement. Engagement. People, if you say something about a philosophy to most people on the street, certainly outside these halls, they would have the image in their mind would be of a kind of detached individual bumping into walls, deep in thought and totally disconnected from reality, or day-to-day reality. But that's not the way the classical philosophers certainly thought about it, and many to follow. I'm not going to try to remember the history of philosophy, but woven throughout 2,500 years or more of philosophical thought and writing is a continuous thread of contemplation of humans governing themselves and the systems that they use, and the principles, more importantly the systems, the principles they use to govern themselves. Wouldn't it be interesting? I haven't thought about this, but wouldn't it be interesting if a certain number of hours is the study of credits, the study of philosophy were a requirement to run for public office? It would certainly thin out the ranks. But it's something we might think about. Change the nature of the kind of people in public office and probably the way they do their jobs. I would imagine there'd probably, if you count on the fingers of two hands, members of Congress today who have seriously read or thought about philosophy in any age, including the rather thin age in which we live philosophically. But they would be better at what they did if they had spent some time, at the very least, reading the classical philosophers, what they had to say about the art of caring for souls, self-governance, democracy, the principles of the republic, and so forth. Our founders, I spent a kind of amateur early American historian, or constitutional historian, and our founders were learned people, with the exception of Abigail Adams and a few others, mostly men, unfortunately. But I do think there were probably a lot more women thinking about the founding of this country than are given credit for. In any case, the men we are familiar with were pretty astute and well educated in the classics. Jefferson himself read and wrote in both Latin and classical Greek, and read the original philosophers and thinkers in their original language. And the erudition they brought to the task of founding a country was heavily permeated by classical thought. The idea of the republic, of course, originated in ancient Greece, 500 BC, give or take a century. And we still salute. I keep looking around always when I make this comment for the flag, because it's almost never there. No reason it should be, but we salute the flag of the United States of America and the republic for which it stands. Now again, walk outside these learned halls and ask the first 10 people you meet why we salute the flag of a republic, or what a republic is, probably couldn't tell you. But it was very, very important to the founders, some of whom were scared to death of the notion of democracy, even in its ancient form, because they, at that time, in the 18th century, second half of the 18th century, very much equated democracy with the French Revolution, which in the case of the Adamses and Franklins and Hamilton scared them to death, meant mobs in the street. My mentor Jefferson was always more revolutionarily inclined, believing there ought to be one about once a generation, just to keep people stirred up and thinking and engaged. Didn't scare him so much. But the debate over the founding of this country was almost totally conducted in the language of the Republic, and not in the abstract, but in the concrete. The Republic as described by the early Greeks and the pre-imperial Romans. Language has consequences, one of the things you learn in philosophy. And if you believe strongly in the Republic whose flag we salute, that places limitations on what America can and cannot do. I'm sure you know this, but there has never been, to my knowledge, and once again, it's a high-level audience, so correct me if you know I'm wrong, never been in human history a government that was simultaneously a republic and an empire. Best evidence, of course, is Rome, 1st century BC. So if you salute the flag of a republic, what does that mean? It means you can't be an empire. Now, that fact alone might have saved 30,000 American casualties and hundreds of thousands of Iraqi casualties if our leaders had simply understood that you can't salute the flag of a republic and conduct an imperial enterprise anywhere in the world, certainly a region as troubled as the Middle East. Nevertheless, that would be a very good argument, by the way, for the study of some kind of philosophy, or the study of language. What did the founders mean when they called this a republic, and did it proscribe what their successors could or could not do in their conduct among themselves or in the world? In our conduct among ourselves, one of the principles of the Republic was popular sovereignty. And popular sovereignty meant that citizens had a duty. Democracy is about rights. A republic is about duties. And that's probably why we don't talk much, even in classrooms, about the Republic, because it's all about duties, citizen duties to participate. Americans hate to pay taxes. They are reluctant to put on a uniform. A lot of talk now about ending the war in Iraq. You can end it in 72 hours by instituting the draft. A lot of people who've been kind of agnostic about whether we ought to be there or not, particularly under the age of 25, would certainly find out where Iraq is very quickly and decide to call their member of Congress and say we ought to get out of there. Duty. We complain about paying taxes for the services we receive. We don't want to put on the uniform. And we resist jury duty. But a republic is all about duty. If you put the two together, Jefferson, of course, said that we are a democratic republic. Even though in our founding, landowners were the constituents and voters, and men landowners, virtually all white. Jefferson, despite the fact he was a slave owner, always pressed for expanding participation, not just in voting, but in the conduct of the daily life of the polis. And he described America as a democratic republic, but if you put the two together, democracy is about rights, and deservedly so. In the 20th century, we've made great strides in terms of the rights of minorities and the rights of women. Still a long way to go in many respects. But we have broadened out rights, and much of the debate in this country, certainly in the second half of the 20th century, was about expansion of rights. Almost no talk about duties. I took a course in my public school in Ottawa, Kansas, 8th grade civics. I didn't know at the time or since since I found out, but I didn't know at the time what this course was all about. But we had to take civics. We also, interestingly enough, in that small town, farming town, had mandatory 2 years Latin. I think back on that, and I think it's extraordinary. I don't know about the public schools in Denver. I'd be amazed if you have mandatory 2 years of Latin in the public schools. Anyway, I think if you put the two together, what you have a political formula that says we must earn our rights by performance of our duties. And that ought to be taught, it seems to me, in every class in America, having to do with government, politics, philosophy, or anything else. If we are a republic, all members of the republic have duties. If we're a democracy, we have rights. But if you put the two together, it means you have to do something to earn your rights. Now, you can have huge philosophical debates about this, because rights either exist or they don't exist. And if they exist, and particularly if they're natural rights, then you shouldn't have to earn them. But if you follow the classic definition of a republic, you have duties. And they are not abstract. They are, at the very least, to participate. Because you're the sovereign. The way that formulation works out, if you have popular sovereignty, you have no choice, if you're the sovereign, but to act like a sovereign. And acting like a sovereign means helping in the process of governance. Basically means self-governance. So you can't stand on the street corner and say, I don't like, as one lady once said to me in my political days, I never vote because it only encourages them. This is near kind of center of popular American wisdom about politics, but also where you're near the center of total ignorance. Young people say, I'm not really interested in politics. That's the dumbest thing anybody can say, particularly for a young person. Politics determines the quality of the air that you breathe. It determines whether you're going to have to put on a uniform and get killed. Depends on how much taxes you're going to pay. Depends on what kind of jobs you're going to get. There is no aspect of a young person's life that politics, in the general sense of the word, does not impact. So the dumbest thing anybody can say in a democratic republic is, I don't care anything about politics. Totally. If your only interest is yourself, too many cases that's what it is. Even that requires you to pay attention, because decisions are being made in the city hall, the mayor's office, city council, state house, and in Washington that affect your life every day. So you may not care about politics, but politics cares about you. Now I'm trying to think where I was headed with all this. I think I was headed towards not just politicians, but citizens thinking critically and thinking philosophically, if you will, about their duties, their rights, but how we get from where we are to where we want to go. spent a good deal of time in recent years thinking and writing about strategy, and particularly grand strategy. And grand strategy was defined earlier, 75 years ago, by a British thinker as the application of the nation's powers to the achievement of its large purposes. And I love that definition because it requires you to think about two things. What are your powers? More importantly, what are your large purposes? It would be interesting. Instead of NBC and CBS focusing on how much money Hillary Clinton has raised, they instead held a forum in which all candidates from both parties would write an 800-word essay, give them an hour, in which they described their view of what America's grand strategy in the 21st century should be. And that definition would be given to everyone, the application of the nation's powers to the achievement of its large purposes. Now, of course, every one of them would write Roman numeral 1. America's powers are economic, political, and military. A really smart one would say, we have another power. That power is our constitutional principles, because people respect and admire those when we live up to them, which we don't always do, particularly when we put hoods on people and beat the life out of them in the name of national security. I don't find that in our Constitution. Maybe George W. Bush does. I don't. Suspension of habeas corpus. I was gave a lecture at the British Library a couple weeks ago, and in the British Library is one of the 4 existing copies of the Magna Carta. And the centerpiece of the Magna Carta is the concept of habeas corpus. Nobody can be imprisoned without the right to know before a magistrate or judge why they're in prison. Pretty basic. We just suspended it. We just gave our president the authority to suspend habeas corpus any time he wanted to. I'm obliged to say, because I'm still angry about it, that speaking as a partisan, and I apologize for this, the more enlightened of the 2 Colorado United States senators voted for it, despite the fact he had been the principal law enforcement officer of this state, voted to suspend habeas corpus. Got to think about that. Are we that afraid? Are we that scared that we have to suspend the basic foundational principles on which we stand? Well, that's a diversion. Economic, political, and military powers, and I would add to those the power of our principles. Roman numeral 2, our large purposes. Wouldn't that be interesting? 6 or 8 Democrats, 5 or 6 Republicans, all required, and the clock is ticking, by the way. They've got their blue books there, and they're checking their watches. There's the forum leader standing there going, click, click, click. What are our large purposes? Now, you would think nobody should even announce for president until they could answer that question. But on the other hand, how many of those candidates do you think could answer that question? Now, some would say, defeat terrorism. Others would say, protect America's economy. Those are all, I suppose, good purposes, but what are they the basis for America's grand strategy in a new century of revolutions? Globalization, the information revolution, failing states, changing nature of warfare. One other thing philosophy teaches you, or philosophical thinking teaches you, is to analyze the times in which you live. I would guess most of those dozen or so presidential candidates would probably say that, the first 7 years of the century aren't that much different from the last. I think they're hugely different. I think the difference began in the last century. But if you enter into leadership, particularly maximum leadership, thinking, things are pretty much the same, and they're not the same, you are bound to make some, not only big mistakes, probably tragic ones. So one of the requirements before you even get the Blue Book to write the 800-word essay should be, you don't even get in the room to take that grand strategy exam unless you can say that you can characterize in 100 words the age in which you live. I just did in 4 categories: globalization, the information revolution, failing states or eroding nation-state sovereignty, and the changing nature of warfare. That wasn't that hard. That's more than 100 words. So that gets you in the door. Then you get the Blue Book and you get an hour to write 800 words on what you're going to do about those realities. Because you can't have a grand strategy in the abstract. It has to relate to the realities of your age. And too many of our leaders haven't really taken the time or trouble to think about the age in which we live. You ask them, what's the new reality? I bet you all of them would say terrorism. And if that's your view of the 21st century, that is your focus, as it is with the current occupant of the White House. And all of your decisions are made in that context. So language has consequence, as we have seen about the Republic, but ideas have consequences also. And if you've got the wrong central organizing principle, almost everything that flows from that is going to be wrong. You're going to invade the wrong countries, or you're going to invade, the national security policy of the United States since September 2002 is that we will invade, in our own national security interest, any country that harbors terrorists. The President of the United States said that. Condoleezza Rice said that. Donald Rumsfeld said that. Colin Powell said that. Well, whatever else you think of the idea, it's based on a pretty flawed premise. You should think it through philosophically, analytically. That would mean we have to invade Germany, Great Britain, France, Spain, and a whole host of other countries, because they all harbor terrorists. See? So, understanding the age in which you live, understanding what you do about that age, can lead you in really some terrible directions. Some people may not have ever had a course in philosophy of any kind. Ancient philosophy, religious philosophy, existentialism, whatever. Still think, what I would say in the kind of the vernacular, think philosophically. They have a capacity to understand the age in which they live, to understand the powers that their nation possesses, not just the United States, but others, and to understand where they want their country to go, or a collection of countries, in the case of real statespersons. And they turn out to be historic figures, Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, a few others. They may not have been able to get an A, even a B, in a philosophy course, history class. But nevertheless, they possess those qualities of intellect, almost by nature, that cause them to qualify for leadership, big leadership, historic leadership. And, when I say candidates to lead this country, maybe even any democracy, ought to take some courses in philosophy. What I really mean is they ought to have some foundation in analysis of language, analysis of history, analysis of power, politics, analysis of purpose, and I said history, and history plays a key role in this. You would also be amazed, maybe you wouldn't be. I was, even in a better time, at the number of elected officials who had almost literally no sense of history. Or had, they may have read a book about World War II, or in the early days when I went there, they were veterans of World War II, and they had some experience with it. It was pointed out to me the other day that we now have a generation in class, in education, who has no living memory of the Vietnam War. Stunning. And there was much to be learned from the Vietnam War. If we had learned it, we wouldn't be in Iraq. So history has consequences also. And if you elect leaders that have no sense of history, they are, as was predicted, going to repeat it over and over again. It's one person's definition of hell, repeating historical mistakes over and over and over again. We're kind of in that process now. So there ought to be some facility, and the facility in our system is you, to require our leaders, I'm not sure I would say to be smarter, that wouldn't hurt either, but to have a sense of the meaning of words, to have a sense of the consequence of language, to have a sense of the age in which they live, and to have a sense of history, and to be able to apply that sense of history and all those other senses to the job of government, not just for themselves, but for future generations. Thank you all very much. Question and comment time. Yes.
Thank you so much. That was enlightening. I was hoping you could say maybe a little bit more about the God part.
Oh, yes.
We heard quite a bit about Caesar and politics.
I got so interested
Really
in
gently.
what I was saying. I didn't forget God. But
And maybe in particular, you could talk a little bit about the role that God or religion has to play, not just in the analysis of purpose, but the creation of purpose. Because it seems that in a republic, our sovereigns need to not have their own vision of purpose, but to represent democratically purpose. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about God and the creation of purpose and sort of give us some more insight.
Well, I've always had kind of a historic personal bargain. I would not talk about God if he did not talk about me. Kind of joke. I think it's a very good question, and thinking it through. There was ambivalence, but a constructive ambivalence on the part of the people that founded the country, obviously. We have a First Amendment separation of church and state, and there were historic reasons for that. They came out of a European heritage, by and large, where kings picked popes and popes picked kings, and neither of them came out very well in the process. And where religious movements of one kind or another often dominated the politics of the country, or vice versa. And so they wanted to say, you're absolutely free to worship in any way you can. Jefferson was asked once by someone about a person's religious beliefs, and he said, it neither breaks my leg or steals my purse, therefore it's up to him, whatever his religious beliefs are. That is to say, until you seek to impose your religious beliefs on others, free to worship, as he said, No God or all gods. No God, one God, or as many gods as you want to worship. On the other hand, as advocates of the insertion of religion into our public life, I've repeatedly said we open our sessions of Congress with a prayer. We have "In God We Trust" on our coins, and so on and so forth. We have a God reference in our Pledge of Allegiance, and so forth. So God is there, but God is also not there in a way. Not there in a sense of imposing one group's view of God's purpose and message on others who may not share it. And I think that's the line that we crossed recently. As I say in here, we have had religious revivals in this country since the age of Jonathan Edwards, pre-revolutionary period, the Great Awakening. And those religious revivals, all the way up through Billy Sunday at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, Billy Graham in the middle part of the 20th century and beyond, and others have, by and large, not inserted themselves in the political process. If they felt that America was losing its way, the sponsors of those revivals, largely Protestant evangelicals, not always, but largely, have sought to correct those social ills, but not by dominating one political party or both, or the legal output of those parties. Not saying, the one exception I think is the temperance movement. You can't drink alcohol. We all know what happened with that. But it was an attempt to legislate morality, and it didn't work so well. Or legislate morality where there was social disagreement over whether it should be legislated or not. Obviously, we don't kill, etc., etc. But when you get to factionalism, or when you get to one wing of one branch of one religion, which is what we've had in recent years, seeking to impose its will, its beliefs, its structures, its norms on society at large is when the trouble starts. And that's, the title obviously comes from the quotation from Jesus when one of his interlocutors sought to catch him out by saying, should your followers pay taxes? And he said, render unto God that which is God's, and unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. Any doubt you may have in your mind about how smart he was should have been resolved by that formulation. Can't do better than that. That said it all. And that should, by the way, I think was kind of the principle behind the First Amendment separation of church and state. Everyone is free to believe what they will and worship as they will, so long as it doesn't harm others. They are not free to impose their religious beliefs on society at large. They can argue, they can preach, they can write, but where the line was crossed in my judgment in recent years was the insertion by this faction into one political party and the domination of that party, even as a minority group, in its selection of candidates, and that's persisting as we speak, in this state, down to and including the local level, school boards, county commissions. I am told that that party would interview candidates for its nomination, and they had to pass muster on things like abortion and gay marriage and so on, issues like that, that had nothing, almost nothing to do with the job they were running for, but it was a screening process. Now that to me is over the line. We can all draw the line where we wish. Theoretically, I suppose, America could be governed by atheists. Jefferson usually described as deists. They were all over the lot. Baptists, other persuasions. Would the country be worse off? First of all, I don't think that's ever going to happen. What other people, including as early as the Tocqueville, observe about us. It's how religious we are. We're a religious country. Europeans and others, Asians, think we're religious in an almost bizarre way. But that's their problem, not ours. Anyway, people profess themselves to be religious in higher numbers than almost any other country on earth. And therefore, religious belief and religious practice play probably a greater role generally in our politics than they do in most other countries. I've said in my own lifetime, I grew up in an evangelical church, although not fundamentalist. And I have said that when I ran for office in the state in '74 and re-election in '80, and even for president in '84, I almost never got a question, what church do you belong to? What are your religious beliefs? Because I was not well known starting out in either Colorado or the nation, I got a lot of questions about who I was and where I came from. And in many cases, I would give that background and make reference to the fact I was raised in an evangelical church, went to that church's college in Oklahoma, etc. And that would be it. But that's gone almost like this, and now almost the first thing you have to do, certainly running for president, maybe even other offices too, is kind of give a testimonial to your religious beliefs. Is that harmful? Probably not, except that those who kind of see it that religious beliefs as a private matter are a bit put off by it and think, well, is that anybody's business? But if they're ambitious enough politically, they'll probably get over that hesitation and give their religious background or invent one. But it's a rambling non-answer to your question. I'm trying to. I've often said that I find myself emulating the late Hubert Humphrey, with whom I had served, and I was amazed always in those early years to watch Hubert, for whom I had unbelievable respect, stand up at 7 in the morning before some group and just start talking, and it'd be amusing and ramble all over the place until he said something that interested him, and then he'd go off talking about whatever it was that had interested him. That's kind of what I find myself doing.
I just wanted to ask a question about demagoguery, because I think that applies to both religion and politics. And I guess the question is, as the campaign season is starting to get going, people like Obama because it's fresh, and I think that's a way of saying he's non-demagogic. There was that 1984 ad spoofing Hillary Clinton, which was about her demagogic qualities. And then there's McCain, who's trying to revive his Straight Talk Express, which is another way of saying non-demagogic. So I'm curious, given that you've run for president and that you've been involved in politics, public speaking, and now you read and speak about it, what do you think do you have a personal definition of when someone is demagoguing, and why do you think it gets picked up and carried forward so reliably by fairly educated media and people in general?
I think you would have a better definition of demagogy than I would. I think the common definition of that would be pandering to a group by saying to that group what it wants to hear, and further inflaming the passions of the group by saying what that group wants to hear you say. Using that definition, almost all politicians, in some degree, are guilty. It's too easy to stand before a labor group or a women's group or an environmental group or any group and tell them what they want to hear. Now, back to the previous question. It gets a little more complicated when you're standing in a pulpit in a church as a candidate and delivering a sermon, in effect, hitting all the notes that congregation wants to hear it on its agenda, in many cases gay marriage and abortion and so on, to get the crowd pumped up and rushing out of the church, synod church, to knock on doors on your behalf. I probably question a couple of the illustrations you used. The Hillary ad, it seemed to me, was less about demagogy and more about, what am I trying to think? Kind of seeking to be all things to all people by not saying anything. To me, that was the criticism. And you had the kind of robotic audience out there just kind of listening in an 89 Orwellian sense. And that was what the hammer thrower kind of destroyed, was that more of a kind of passionless propaganda. The excerpts from the Hillary speech were not, to any point that I could tell, it was just kind of blah, blah, blah. And that was what the hammer thrower was kind of destroying. But in any case, I take your point, and I don't think you're ever going to get rid of it, because as I say, it's too easy. If the first stages, the early stages of a campaign are to recruit workers, and they are, you go where the workers are. And the workers are in many of those organizations. And they're in the organizations because they share the belief of those organizations. So by identifying yourself with those shared beliefs, you are recruiting volunteers and workers and increasingly contributors. And that's going to go on and on. I have enough faith in the American character to believe that if you try to fake it, the one thing Americans can do, not soon enough in many cases, is spot a phony. Sometimes we elect them and then find out they're phony, but better if we figure that out ahead of time. And given all the media, we ought to be able to. But there is, I think we have I wouldn't say it's unique, but I do think it kind of comes from the American frontier and the huckster coming through town selling snake oil, kind of healthy skepticism about, and by and large Americans are skeptical about politicians, as I was saying before. I'm not going to vote for them because it only encourages them. But there is that sense that you're not going to get me with that line, you know. I think there is an ability, there is an authenticity meter in the American character, and you can be a pony for a while, I'll put it that way, and in your own review, but you get outside that, and over time, if you're just hot air, it's going to collapse.
I was very taken by your identification of democracy in terms of rights and republic in terms of duties, and the notion of a democratic republic as earned rights with the performance of duties. And I was taken by that in some thinking that I've had about the war on terror. And one of the potential casualties of a war on terror, and maybe even a successful war on terror, is our modern notion of the nation state. And the modern notion of the nation state is in an international community identified in terms of rights, right of territorial integrity and political sovereignty. But there's a sense in which the notion that you offered of a democratic republic, earned rights on the basis of performance of duties, might actually be immune to that concept of one of the casualties of the war on terror is our modern notion of the nation state. And I'm troubled by this notion, and yet I'm intrigued by the possibility at the same time, and I'm wondering if you can.
Well, I understand that, and I'm kind of in the same boat, except the more I've studied why the founders conducted the founding process in the language of the Republic, the more persuaded I am by it. And I come out of the so-called liberal democratic tradition of the Roosevelt era, where government does have a benign purpose to play in creating equality and offering opportunity and rights and broadening participation and leveling the playing field and all those things. And many of the rights advances came, if I may say so, from the Democratic Party, not the other party. And the country is better for it. So, but I've also, when I was in office, 70s and 80s, began to sense this increasing despair about what all of this is going on, and I can't do anything about it. What can I do? I used to get this all the time in town hall meetings. What can I do? You guys are, you know, it's a Cold War, we're going to have nuclear exchange, nothing I can do. A kind of hopelessness and despair brought on by detachment. And so that's when I went back to Jefferson and the founders, and Jefferson particularly late in life. This is what took me back to school. And I wrote on this topic. Jefferson started writing letters. Some of his 75,000 letters he wrote this out to John Adams, saying we missed the point. We created, the way we solved the problem of scale, and the problem of republics has throughout history been one of scale. They've all been small. Athens, Venice. The first time you began to have federated republics was the Greek cantons, all of which started out to be autonomous, and then they combined. Montesquieu really was the philosophical father of the notion of the federated republic. And that's what so Jefferson said, we solved the problem of you've got 13 republics here, and how do we preserve their autonomy, but collectivize by creating a federated republic. And each of the 13 republics retains its identity. But these are representative republics. There is no place for the citizen to participate other than vote. So he said, I think we ought to, he didn't say amend the Constitution, but recreate what he called the ward or elementary republic. Today we would call it neighborhood. Neighborhoods were small towns where he didn't say forced, but citizens are more or less obliged once a month or periodically to get together, discuss the quality of their schools. And he, of course, was the father of the public school system, but he insisted that it be governed by the local republic and conditioned by it. And all the issues that affect our community. And that way you recreate the assembly, the Greek and Roman assembly. Not literally getting into a square, but very close to it. He loved, his analogies were the New England town meeting. He and Madison made a trip up through New England before they either became president, and were fascinated by the New England town meeting. He said, Jefferson said, that's exactly what I'm talking about. The other analogy he used was Indian tribal councils. He observed or was told about tribes getting together and having their councils. And he said, that's what I'm talking about, that kind of thing. So that's when I got fascinated by the Republic. How do you have a Rooseveltian big government democracy and at the same time empower citizens? And I ended up writing a doctoral thesis on it. Oddly enough, I was also co-chairing the Commission on National Security at the same time, 2000-2001. Our commission had determined that the next big threat was terrorism. It issued reports to that effect, and on all of the dates here, I submitted the draft of my thesis the end of 2000, and then revised it in early 2001, January, February, March, submitted the final draft in June of 2001, and sat my examination in July and got my degree. All right. The commission issued its final report, but its preliminary reports had come out in 99 and 2000 to the effect that terrorists were going to attack America. And in our final report to the new administration, January 31st, 2001, we said create a federal capability to protect our homeland. Nothing was done. But the illustrations I gave in my thesis, going along the same track, was local security. that if the threat of this sort, and I was citing my own commission in my doctoral thesis, if there is a threat of terrorism, who under the Constitution has the principal responsibility for responding to that? The Second Army. In the Constitution, 2 armies in the Constitution, the Standing Army and the militia. And the militia became in the late 19th century what we today call the National Guard. So the commission, there was a little bit of incest going on here, because it was insisted on the commission that we make the National Guard the backbone of Homeland Security for philosophical reasons. The reason the founders recognized the role of the militia was they didn't want the Standing Army enforcing the laws of the United States. That was a danger to the Republic. So they recognized in the Constitution, at least 3 places, the authority of the militia, and gave the militia the authority to defend this country. And so I put all that in there. Got my degree in July 2001, and September 11th, the attack occurred. So then I went back to Oxford to a conference, I think, in late 2002, spring of 2002. Not my advisor, but my examiner, one of my examiners who was the head of the politics department at Oxford, said, he said, I thought you were a little fatty to put this terrorism business in your thesis. But he said, I cannot tell you the number of faculty meetings and cocktail parties where I have dined out on the statement that I had a doctoral candidate who predicted the terrorist attacks on America. I don't know that that was responsive to anything.
Might that notion, though, be expanded to the international sphere? That nation states not only are independent operators with rights, but also with obligations.
Well, of the revolutions, remember that I mentioned globalization, information, changing nature of warfare, erosion of nation state and sovereignty. Those are revolutions. Let's look at the realities. Proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, terrorism itself. But climate change, mass south-north migrations, disintegration of states. Yugoslavia, Iraq's going to disintegrate, whether we like it or not. Because these are artificial nations created by colonial powers, by and large, under the pressure of the Cold War, the colonial era. Pandemics, the list goes on. All those new realities have 2 things in common. They can't be solved by military means alone, and they can't be solved by one nation alone. We are in the middle of a neo-internationalist era that our government doesn't even realize. We're becoming more unilateralist when we should be becoming more internationalist. We cannot solve these problems by ourselves. Now, does that automatically mean the international institutions created 60 years ago, by and large in the middle 20th century, are adequate? No. I mean, the UN's got a lot of problems, but it's 60 years old, for heaven's sake. And the people who founded it, as brilliant as they were, weren't as smart as Jefferson and Madison and Hamilton. So it hasn't aged as well, and we have been part of that problem. John Bolton. I mean, we've had this wonderful American attitude about the UN. We're not going to surrender any of our sovereignty, and we may not, if we don't like what they're doing, pay our dues. And then when they fail, we can say, see, we told you. They can't do the job. So it's a self-fulfilling little syndrome. We could talk here for another hour about what the implications of eroding nation-state sovereignty are. But you've got 2 choices. Either let states disintegrate with chaos involved in that, or integrate at least the 60 liberal democracies in the world into some new international order to address these new realities. But believe me, remember where you heard it, the single most important political, maybe philosophic or political word in the 21st century is sovereignty. Because you can't solve the problems without internationalizing them, and you can't internationalize them without surrender of some surrender of nation-state sovereignty. And that's the crux of the problem. Yes?
I have a concern about the form of corporate control relative to sovereignty. Reading about North not anymore. Can you say something about that? They love wars because they make money. We know that this administration wanted to be correct from day one, and they set it up so they could. I think a lot is really not quite what it seems.
I understand completely what you're saying. I would encourage you to make some distinctions. I think some corporations like animal farms are more equal, that is to say more powerful than others. So not all corporations, by being a corporation, does not necessarily fit you under the description you made, but some corporations do, some industries do. I'd make the distinction not just between companies, but between industries. Many industries are benign. The former spy novelist John Le Carre has written a couple of novels on how unbenign the pharmaceutical industry is. Peddling bad drugs in Africa and manipulating samples and things like that. He's kind of focused on that industry. The one I think we ought to focus on more than the other, and that I focused on more than the other, is the energy industries, particularly oil. Andy and a few others here don't want to hear this lecture, so I won't give it. But we import what our oil consumption increases, largely to fuel inefficient vehicles. We import more than 60% of that oil from abroad. That would be in 20 years 70% of an increasing percent of an increasing import. 20 to 25% of that, not all of it, 20 to 25%, critical percent of that import comes from the Persian Gulf, the most dangerous, unstable region of the world. Now telling the story a lot, but it's true, happens to be true, has the advantage of being true. I gave a talk to a business group and the Denver Business Journal. The editor introduced me by reading a story from their Denver Business Journal. Senator Gary Hart introduced legislation to tax imported oil. Date April 16, 1980, 27 years ago. So I don't come to this story recently. I have been on the case of the danger and insecurity flowing from imported oil for a long, long time. And even predating 80. I ran in 74. I was critical of the oil industry then. Denver Post ran a cartoon of a giant ocean tanker, on the side of which said Exxon Mobil, or just Exxon. And they had a tiny little, like, pirate sailing ship up again, firing at it, and it said Hart on the ship or something. But I was trying to make that point even then. I think, now, do you blame Exxon and Texaco and the others for supplying the addiction that President Bush finally came to recognize, that others recognize for a moment? They're just the suppliers. They're not creating it. Just doing their job. We want to drive big cars. We want to get 12 miles per gallon, pay $3 a gallon, soon 4, soon 5. And, more importantly, sacrifice the lives of our sons and daughters who get the oil. That's not their problem, it's our problem. But, so all of that to say, I think some industries, maybe even some companies inside those industries, are more culpable and possibly more dangerous than others. But it is a pogo situation. Is the problem Exxon, or is the problem us? Have we found the enemy and the enemy is Exxon? Or have we found the enemy and the enemy is us? Yes.
It's interesting that
In the media, by the way, I have a lifelong ban on being able to talk about the media. For reasons all of you are too young to remember.
I brought up energy because in the context of characterizing our era or our age, there may well be a link between energy and poverty in the developing world. So I wondered if you would comment on the morality of our nation's energy situation in the international context.
Well, let me put on the face of a traditional buy the oil. What the country does with the revenues is their business. We can't tell them what to do with their own revenues. We can't dictate their policies. We try to give full countries aid, and it ends up in the pockets of the president and his family. And it never gets to the people. That's true, by the way, not too much of the time. But what you run into, the response to an observation like yours is, we can't on the one hand say we want to buy your oil, and by the way, the money we pay you, you have to spend in the following way. They are sovereign states.
But we're not buying oil so much from Africa, for example.
Nigeria increasing.
Yes, okay.
Well, you may ask if we're importing 60 to 70%, 25% of that comes from Persian Gulf. Where's the rest come? Canada, Mexico, Venezuela. Now, if you want to tell Hugo Chavez how to spend the oil revenues, he'll probably have a very rude response to you.
But I'm asking about morality.
Big pardon?
Morality.
Yeah. And what about?
What about the situation that we are in our world, with energy and global warming, and our role in that? Is there a moral component to that?
Oh, absolutely.
Taking off your political mask now and talking
Think just about the morality of what I said a minute ago. Our energy policy, the people say we need one, but we have one. Our energy policy is this: we will continue to import oil from unreliable, unstable regions of the world to fuel energy inefficient automobiles. And if the oil gets cut off, to sacrifice the lives of our sons and daughters to get the oil. I don't know of anything more immoral than that, but it is the truth. So that's immoral. Of course, the broader question of what the oil revenues go for, the oil revenues in Saudi Arabia go to keep the royal family in power. And the same is true in a lot of other nations. The results of our consumption of that oil, combustion of that oil, is of course, we consume 25% of the oil energy of the world, and therefore we produce as 6% of the world's population, 5 or 6%. Massively disproportionate amount of the climate problem. Yes, it's very important. I mean, I can't think of, and yet we're waging war in the Middle East, ostensibly to bring democracy to that region, even though we're perpetuating. I mean, we're supporting oligarchies in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Pakistan, all of whom are in the region. This is not lost on the people there. So when our president says we're making war in Iraq to bring democracy to it, they're laughing up their sleeves. They're laughing openly and publicly. What about Egypt? What about Saudi? What about Pakistan? Not democracies. Yes. And then this may be the last one.
I'm fascinated by the distinction you draw between rights and duties. And it strikes me that exploring the concept of duty might have a number of philosophical dimensions. But one is that it seems that duty requires a relationship to other generations, whereas right is something that appears in the individual. And I wonder if whether you found that duty, understanding the concept of duty and the importance of duty, doesn't require more of a historical sense, maybe a philosophical sense.
Could you hear in the back? Yes, okay. I'm the only one in the room going deaf, so. The key, my response is that in both cases, duties and rights is intergenerational accountability. This ties perfectly in the last question. We think only about ourselves, in horizontally, but also vertically. That is to say, what pleases me now? The exception to that is private legacy. Americans spend a huge amount of time thinking and planning for what they're going to leave their children. And the more they have, the more time they spend thinking about it. It's a huge industry, one I'm becoming increasingly familiar with. It's the industry that writes wills and calculates estates and maneuvers around taxes and all the rest. We spend an amazing amount of time thinking about our private legacy and zero time thinking about our public legacy. Those rich people paying hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to clever tax lawyers to pass on as much of their fortune to their children are not always, but in many cases, people who don't give a fig for climate change, for wars, for deteriorating schools, for universal health care, or any of the dominant issues of our day. And yet they will turn themselves into pretzels to leave that private legacy to their children. To me, it's madness. I mean, what if you have a mansion in a gated community with your own private army to protect it? You're still going to breathe the same air. Your gated community is probably not going to be on the coast anymore. It'll be up higher because you say, well, I'm going to sell that $17 million house of mine in Palm Beach because Palm Beach because the water's going to rise. Al Gore told me the water's going to rise. I'm sure glad I got rid of it before everybody else figured it out. And the dummy that bought it is going to probably be there when the water rises. But that's the way they're thinking. And the idea of a public legacy, of trying to leave a better country and increasingly better world to those same children, is almost non-existent. I mean, they'll give some money to a private charity. This to me is why I so dislike the 1,000 Points of Light and faith-based charity. Because if you added all the private charity in the world, I mean in the nation together, it wouldn't make a dent in the public problems that our country faces in terms of poverty, housing, unemployment, and everything else. So this kind of cynical notion that you can advocate private charity and reduce government responsibility is nothing but cynicism. So I think we ought to teach not only duty to each other, but duty to future generations, and based upon our understanding of the past. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much for coming. Sorry I was late. Oh, no, that's not a problem at all. Sure.
He's not hanging out and chatting with us.
I mean, at least insofar as the cultures that seem to be re-embracing what may or may not be current fundamentalism seem to be diametrically opposed, and I'm wondering where you would see that there would be some type of negative space that these different cultures could traffic in.
Well, the negative space is being created by the kind of counterpole between these different fundamentalisms. I mean, I don't like the word fundamentalism as a theoretical term. You know, Martin Marty started that in this fundamentalism project because he was trying to, metaphorically apply the history of Christian Protestant fundamentalism to, what were really sort of, traditionalist movements. I mean, would you call, Hindu nationalism and that kind of assertion of Hinduism, which, when I was in college was supposed to be the great ironic, peaceful religion of tolerance and acceptance. I mean, the notion of Hindu fundamentalism just sounds like an oxymoron, but there it is, tied in with nationalism. And one of my colleagues, Ginny Shimatsu, he was a student of Hindu nationalism, and she just agrees. I mean, the term fundamentalism doesn't really apply. Even the term fundamentalism doesn't really apply to Islam, even though again we use it. We talk about Islamic terrorism, fundamentalism, and as one Islamic scholar pointed out, this is kind of silly to be talking this way, because if fundamentalism is used to mean what it originally meant, that is belief in the literal truth of the text, then you can't be a Muslim and not be a fundamentalist, because the absolute, textual, to the letter truth of the Quran is kind of an anchor belief for Muslims. You don't have to believe in the literal truth of the Bible to be a Christian, but you do to be a Muslim. And so, so there's that kind of association with violence and so forth. But there's no, there's no evidence that just because you take a text literally means you're going to be violent. I mean, that's just crazy. What's happening is that you're seeing this kind of reaction worldwide to the Enlightenment. I mean, look what's happening in the Catholic Church. Look what's happening in the Episcopal Church. I mean, where is the quote movement of conservatism, which is horrifying us? It was said about the appointment of Benedict XVI to Ratzinger, saying, well, there was just a German coup, and, an effort to to kind of maintain the hegemony of Europe. And what they're finding out is that it was basically the, we used to call the Third World that was behind Ratzinger. Why? Because he was going to keep, the traditional faith. It's a reaction against, European cosmopolitanism and colonialism. I mean, face it, folks, I know this is probably going to stone me when I say this, but the Enlightenment ideal of liberal academia, that we all subscribe to and we tut-tut when anybody challenges this, is what's really being challenged by global Latinization. History is with the, quote, fundamentalists, not with the Enlightenment. And I think Derrida is, the point. And a lot of what's happening right now is very much like what was happening in the 5th century, with the fall of Rome, intellectually as well as culturally.
Although you could say that fundamentalism as such is an attempt to reduce the complexity of religion to certain fundamental parts. Fundamentalism in that sense.
That's what it meant in the original sense.
Yeah.
And
that's
I have a trivia question I always throw out at parties. Like, where did fundamentalism start? And they say, well, it must have been among Southern Baptists in Appalachia in the 1930s, after the Scopes trial. I say, no, it started at Princeton University in the 1890s. The first fundamentalists were Princeton philosophers and theologians, British empiricists who also wanted to believe in the Bible. That's where the term fundamentalism comes from. So-called fundamentals of Christianity.
Okay.
What presupposes the Enlightenment, right?
Yeah, it's a reaction against.
And if you're interested in all this kind of stuff in American religion, I'll recommend my latest book to you, which is called Next Reformation by Baker Academic Books, which is probably the hottest selling book I've ever written, because all the evangelicals are buying it up. And basically what I'm saying is, the book is that I trace their own history, their own genealogy. I said, what we call fundamentalism, and what, the defense of, the truth of the Bible and Christianity. I said, this is just all enlightenment stuff. It's about, I said, if you want to liberate evangelical faith, read Derrida, read Deleuze. In fact, this weekend I'm going to be down in Texas giving a talk to Criswell Seminary students. They bought 100 copies of the book, and about 2/3 of them were delighted. The other third is organizing a protest. I've never had a protest organized.
Contained in that discussion, though, is the idea that the corruption of epistemology, any epistemology, is reflective of the corruption of our language.
Well, you say corruption or so much this sort of sedimentation of our language. Because, what really is postmodernism? I've always been looking for a way to come up with kind of 3 words to describe postmodernism to somebody, because that's always the question you get. What is postmodernism? You say, well, there's many kinds of postmodernism, and we don't really know. That doesn't Postmodernism is really anti-representationalism. That's all it is. And what is anti-representationalism? It's basically started with Nietzsche and his attack on the Enlightenment. The idea that in a sense that there is some kind of universal truth value that is carried in concepts as opposed to the evanescence of the sign. This is what you want to see the origins of postmodernism. Read the Gay Science by Nietzsche. That's where it comes from.
We have a class coming into this room, so I hope you all will join me in thanking Professor Rasmussen.
Enjoyed it. I'm sorry that I kind of wrote out late. Yes, asked me to